Tonight we travel to the northernmost edge of the world, where the mountains meet the sea and the last fjord sleeps beneath endless stars. This is a place where winter nights stretch long and dark, and summer days refuse to end. Here, where ancient glaciers carved valleys into the living rock thousands of years ago, where the water runs so deep and clear you can see straight down to the bottom, and where the midnight sun paints the horizon in shades of rose and gold, there exists something remarkable. Beyond the last fjord lies a road that appears only to those who truly need to find it. A road that winds through mist and moonlight, leading to places that exist between waking and dreaming, between memory and reality, between the world we know and the worlds we've forgotten. Our story begins in a small fishing village called Strandvik, nestled at the base of towering cliffs, where a girl named Astrid lived in a house painted the colour of summer sky. If you love magical bedtime journeys like this one, don't forget to subscribe so you never miss an adventure. New stories arrive like gentle dreams, ready to carry you into peaceful sleep. Sweet dreams await those who listen. Astrid was 11 years old, with hair the colour of wheat in late summer, and eyes that matched the grey-blue of the fjord waters when clouds gathered overhead. She was neither tall nor short, neither quiet nor loud, but somewhere comfortably in between, the kind of girl who noticed things, who listened carefully and thought deeply, who preferred watching the patterns of waves to rushing about. She lived with her grandmother in the blue house at the end of the village, where the cobblestone path turned to dirt and wild grass grew tall against the weathered wooden fence. It was a good house, sturdy and warm, with a red tile roof and white trim around the windows. The walls were thick, built to withstand the fierce winter winds that roared down from the mountains. Inside it smelled perpetually of wool and herbs drying by the fire. Rosemary and thyme hanging in bundles from the kitchen beams, lavender tucked into small sachets in the cupboards, and the ever-present scent of lanolin from the raw wool mormor used in her weaving. Her grandmother was a weaver, known throughout the region for the beauty and quality of her work. People came from as far as Bergen, and even Trondheim, to commission blankets and tapestries from her hands. Mormor's loom stood in the front room where the light was best, then positioned near the large window that looked out over the fjord. She would work there for hours, her fingers moving through the threads with a grace and certainty that seemed almost magical, creating patterns that told stories, reindeer running across snowfields, ships sailing beneath stars, wildflowers blooming in impossible profusion. The rhythmic clack, clack, clack of the loom had been the soundtrack to Astrid's childhood, as familiar and comforting as her own heartbeat. She'd grown up to that sound, had learned to walk holding on to the loom's sturdy frame, had done her homework at the table nearby while Mormor worked, had fallen asleep countless times to its steady rhythm, drifting up through the floorboards to her little room under the eaves. Every morning Astrid would wake to the sound of fishing boats returning to harbour, their bells chiming across the water like distant church music. The sound would drift through her window, mixing with the cry of gulls and the gentle splash of waves against the dock. She would lie there for a moment, warm beneath her thick duvet embroidered with wild flowers, work Mormor had done years ago before Astrid was born, watching the patterns of light dance across her ceiling as sunlight, reflected off the water outside. Then she would rise, dress in her warmest clothes, for even summer mornings could be cool here in the north, and pad downstairs in her wool socks to help her grandmother prepare breakfast. The stairs creaked in familiar places, the third step from the top and the seventh from the bottom, sounds she knew so well she didn't even notice them anymore. Breakfast was always the same. and Astrid loved it precisely for this reason. There was something deeply comforting about the ritual, the predictability of it, the way each day began exactly like the last. Thick porridge with honey and cream, the honey golden and sweet from the hives kept by old Mr. Hansen up the mountain. Dark bread, dense and hearty, baked by Mormor every Saturday in the ancient oven that had been in the house since it was built 100 years ago. The bread was kept fresh in a wooden bread box carved with rose-mailing patterns, traditional Norwegian folk art that Astrid's great-grandfather had made as a wedding gift for his bride. There was butter churned by Mrs. Larson down the road, yellow as sunlight and rich, with the taste of the highland grass the cows ate, and jam made from lingonberries that grew wild on the hillsides, tart and sweet at once, the colour of rubies. Sometimes there were preserved cloudberries too, a rare treat, pale orange and delicate, gathered in the marshes high up on the mountain during the brief summer season when they ripened. They would eat together at the kitchen table, which was scarred and worn from decades of use. You could see the marks where generations of knives had cut bread, the faint ring stains from countless cups of coffee and tea, the slight depression worn into the wood where Morma's grandfather had always sat. It was a table with history, with stories in every mark and scratch. Morning light would stream through the windows, making everything glow with a soft golden radiance. They would talk about small things, what Astrid had dreamed, what Mormor planned to weave that day, whether the weather would hold or if rain was coming. These were ordinary conversations, unremarkable in themselves, but they formed the fabric of their life together, as necessary and comforting as the wool blankets on their beds. After breakfast, Astrid would walk down to the docks with a basket over her arm. This was her favourite part of the day, when the village was coming alive and everyone had stories to share. The path to the docks wound between houses painted in cheerful colours, red and yellow and blue and white, each one perfectly maintained, with flower boxes in the windows and small gardens where vegetables grew alongside roses and delphiniums. The docks themselves were built of weathered wood that had turned silver-grey from years of salt and sun. They stretched out into the fjord like fingers reaching for the deep water, floating on great tarred posts driven deep into the seabed. Small boats bobbed at their moorings, painted in bright colours that reflected cheerfully in the dark water below. Their names were painted on their prows in elegant script. Freya's Gift, North Star, Silver Catch, Dancing Wave. The fisherman knew Astrid well. She'd been coming to the dock since she was small enough to need Morma's hand to steady her on the swaying planks. They saved their best stories for her, knowing how she treasured them, how she would carry them home like precious stones to be examined and admired, polished with repeated remembering until they shone. Old Magnus was her favourite storyteller. He was ancient, or seemed so to Astrid. His face lined like a map of all the places he'd been and all the storms he'd weathered. His hands gnarled like driftwood, but still strong enough to haul heavy nets. His eyes, though, meski forma, were sharp and bright as a young man's, a pale grey blue that seemed to see through weather and wave to the truth beneath. He would lean against his boat, the Sigrid named for his late wife, and tell Astrid about the seals that followed him, out past the mouth of the fjord where the protected waters gave way to the open sea. These seals, he insisted, were not ordinary seals. They sang songs in voices almost human, and sometimes, if you listened very carefully and the wind was right, you could understand the words. They sing about the deep places, Magnus would say, his voice rough from decades of shouting over wind and wave, about underwater caves filled with pearls the size of your fist, about forests of kelp swaying in the current where fish swim in schools so thick they look like silver clouds. They sing about a city beneath the waves, a place of crystal towers and gardens of coral where creatures live that have never seen the sun. Magnus claimed he had once heard them singing about this underwater city in detail, how its buildings were carved from massive shells, how light filtered down from above in shafts of green and blue, how the mer people who lived there had voices that could charm storms to calmness or call whales from 100 miles away. But when Astrid pressed him for more details, he would only smile mysteriously, his eyes twinkling, and change the subject to more practical matters, like the day's catch or the coming weather. Young Eric, who was barely 20 and had just gotten his first boat, a 20-footer he'd bought with money saved from working on his father's vessel, spoke of different wonders. He talked about the northern lights in winter, how they would dance across the sky in ribbons of green and purple and sometimes pink, moving like silk scarves caught in an invisible wind. They move so fast sometimes, Eric would say, his young face alight with the memory, that you can hear them. I swear it's true. A crackling, rustling sound like static electricity, or like someone crumpling paper very far away, or like distant applause. My grandmother told me they were the spirits of our ancestors, celebrating in the heavens, dancing the same dances they danced when they were alive. My mother says they're curtains hiding the windows of heaven, pulled aside so the angels can peer down at the earth and check on us. Eric himself didn't know what to believe. Maybe his grandmother was right, maybe his mother, maybe both, maybe neither. Except maybe, he thought, the lights were something else entirely, something humans didn't have words for yet, something so strange and wonderful that our small human languages couldn't quite capture it. And then there was Mrs. Olsen, who sold fresh fish from her cart near the dock every morning. She was a round, cheerful woman with apple-red cheeks and an infectious laugh that rang out across the harbour like bells. She wore her grey hair in a bun covered with a colourful scarf, and her hands, reddened from years of handling fish and ice, moved with practised efficiency as she cleaned and filleted the morning's catch. Mrs. Olsen knew everything that happened in Strandvik. Who was courting whom, which families were having difficulties, when babies were expected, who had received letters from relatives in America or Australia. But more than village gossip, she knew the old stories, the ones that went back generations, that had been told and retold until they had worn smooth like river stones, until no one quite knew anymore what was history and what was legend and what was something else entirely. She would tell Astrid about the ancient standing stones on the hillside above the village, great grey monoliths arranged in a circle, each one taller than a man, placed there thousands of years ago by people whose names has been forgotten, but whose presence still lingered in the land. The stones had stood there since before the Vikings, since before anyone had thought to write things down. They had been old when Jesus walked in Galilee, old when Rome was young. On Midsummer's Eve, Mrs. Olsen would say, leaning close as if sharing a secret, if you stand in the centre of that stone circle at midnight when the sun barely dips below the horizon before rising again, you can hear singing. Not human singing, mind you, but the earth itself, humming with ancient power and old magic. The stones remember things, you see. They've stood there so long they've become part of the mountain, and mountains remember everything. She claimed her own grandmother had heard the singing once, had stood in the circle on Midsummer's Eve, and heard a sound like 1,000 voices joined in harmony, singing in a language no one spoke anymore, singing songs that made her weep though she couldn't understand the words. When she'd told people about it, some had believed her and some hadn't, but Mrs. Olsen believed, and she told the story with such conviction that Astrid believed too. Astrid collected these stories like some children collected shells or stamps or smooth pebbles from the beach. She kept them in her mind, polishing them with repeated remembering, treasuring each detail. At night, before she slept, she would replay them, letting them carry her off into dreams of seals singing beneath the waves, of northern lights dancing across the sky, of ancient stones humming with the voice of the earth itself. The stories were a gift, freely given, and Astrid received them with the seriousness they deserved. She understood, even at 11, that stories were how people made sense of the world, how they preserved what was important, how they connected past to present and present to future. Stories were how you remembered who you were. But her favourite person in all of Strandvik, indeed, or in all the world, was her grandmother. Mormor they called her, which meant mother's mother in their language. It was a warm word, a comfortable word, a word that tasted of honey and smelled of herbs and felt like coming home on a cold day to a house where a fire burned bright. Astrid's own mother had died when Astrid was too young to remember her clearly. A fever, Mormor said, that had come suddenly one winter and taken her in 3 days, despite all that the doctor could do. Astrid had been not quite 2 years old. She had no memory of her mother's face, no memory of her voice or her touch. Everything she knew about her mother came from Mormor's stories and from the one photograph they had, faded and creased, showing a young woman with kind eyes and Astrid's same smile. After that, it had been just the two of them in the blue house. And that had been enough. More than enough. Mormor was all the family Astrid needed, and Astrid was all the family Mormor had left. They fit together like two pieces of a puzzle, each one completing the other, neither one quite whole alone, but perfect together. Mormor had silver hair she wore in a long braid that hung down her back nearly to her waist. It was thick still, though she was well into her 70s, and it had a beautiful shine to it that caught the light. When she let it down at night to brush it before bed, it would spread around her shoulders like a shawl of moonlight, and Astrid would sometimes help her brush it, counting out the traditional 100 strokes that Mormor said kept hair healthy and strong. Her hands, though aged and marked with the spots and wrinkles that came with decades of life, yet moved with extraordinary grace, like water flowing, Astrid thought, or like birds in flight. When Mormor worked at the loom, her fingers would dance through the threads almost faster than the eye could follow, and yet each movement was precise, deliberate, perfect. She never made mistakes, never had to pull out work and start over. It was as if her hands knew what to do without her mind having to direct them, as if they had their own wisdom born of thousands of hours of practice. She knew every plant that grew on the mountainside, from the tiny alpine flowers that bloomed between the rocks, saxifrage and moss campion and alpine azalea, to the great pines that had stood for centuries, their trunks thick as barrels, their branches spreading wide. She knew which herbs could ease a fever, willow bark tea, which could help you sleep, valerian root, which could settle an upset stomach, peppermint and ginger, or soothe a burn, aloe from the plant on the kitchen windowsill. She knew every bird that nested in the cliffs too, the puffins with their bright orange beaks and comical waddling walks, who came in spring to nest in burrows they dug in the soft earth, the gulls that wheeled and cried overhead, riding the updrafts with wings spread wide, the rare white-tailed eagles that soared on the mountain thermals, their wingspans so great they seemed impossible, their eyesight so keen they could spot a fish moving beneath the water surface from 1,000 feet up. and she knew every story that had been told in the village for 100 years or more. Every wedding and funeral, every birth and death, every storm and celebration. She knew which families had lived in which houses, knew the genealogies going back generations, knew who was related to whom and how. The history of Strandvik lived in her memory, and when people wanted to know about the old days, they came to Mormor. In the evenings, after dinner had been eaten and the dishes washed and put away, Mormor would sit by the fire and tell Astrid stories while her fingers flew through some knitting or mending, never idle. Her voice would take on a particular cadence when she told stories, a rhythm that was almost like singing, that made the words flow like water over stones. She told stories about the first settlers who had come to these valleys in wooden boats 1,000 years ago, Vikings seeking new lands, looking for places to fish and farm, and she told how they had built their first houses from driftwood and sod, how they had learned to harvest the sea and coax crops from the thin soil, how they had survived winters so harsh that even the fjord sometimes froze solid. She told stories about the Black Death that had come in the 14th century, the plague that had killed so many that whole villages has been abandoned, left empty for the grass and trees to reclaim. Strandvik had survived, but barely. Only a handful of families had lived, and they had had to rebuild everything, had to remember how to fish, and farm, and weave, and build, had to preserve the knowledge that might otherwise have been lost. She told about the great storm of 1897, when waves had risen so high they had crashed over the dock and reached the church steps halfway up the hill. Everyone in the village had taken shelter in the church while the storm raged outside, and the pastor, a young man new to Strandvik, had led them in hymns to keep their spirits up. They had sung for hours while the wind screamed and the rain hammered on the roof, and in the morning when the storm passed they had emerged to find the village still standing. One boat had been lost and several houses had lost their roofs, but no one had died. It had been a miracle, people said. Mormor told stories about Astrid's great-great-grandfather, who had been a ship's carpenter and had built boats so fine and true they were still sailing decades after he'd died. She told about Astrid's great-great-grandmother, who had been a midwife and had delivered half the babies born in Strandvik for 40 years. She told about Astrid's own mother, Sus about what she'd been like as a child, curious and brave, quick to laugh, always asking questions, always wanting to know how things worked and why. These evening story sessions were precious to Astrid. They were the thread that connected her to her past, to the long line of people who had lived and loved and struggled and triumphed before she was born. They made her feel part of something larger than herself, part of a story that stretched back into the mists of time and would continue forward long after she was gone. But lately Astrid had noticed something changing in her grandmother. Small things at first, easy to overlook or dismiss. Mormor would pause mid-sentence, her eyes growing distant, her mouth slightly open as if reaching for a word that had slipped just beyond her grasp. She would stare into space for a moment. Her brow furrowed, and then the word would come, or sometimes it wouldn't, and she would continue as if nothing had happened. She would put her glasses down, on the table, on the windowsill, on top of a stack of folded cloth, and then spend 10 minutes looking for them, growing frustrated with herself, saying, "I just had them. Where could they have gone?" Until Astrid would find them in some obvious place and hand them over with a reassuring smile. Once she'd started to tell Astrid a story about her own childhood, about the time she and her brother had snuck away from a midsummer celebration to explore an old abandoned farm up the mountain. She'd gotten halfway through it, describing the overgrown path, the collapsed barn, the house with its door hanging crooked on one hinge, and then stopped, confused, or unable to remember what happened next. She'd sat there in silence for a long moment, her face troubled, and then she'd shaken her head and said, "I'm sorry, little one. I've lost the thread. I can't remember how it ends." Astrid had tried to pretend these things weren't happening, or at least that they weren't serious. She told herself everyone forgot things sometimes, that it was normal, that there was nothing to worry about. People misplaced their glasses. People forgot words occasionally. People lost track of stories. It was just part of being human, part of having a mind that sometimes got tired or distracted. But deep down, in a place she didn't like to examine too closely, she was afraid. She had already lost her mother, even if she couldn't remember that loss directly. The thought of losing Mormor, not to death perhaps, but to the slow fading of memory, to a fog that would gradually obscure everything that made her grandmother herself, was almost too painful to bear. What would happen if Mormor forgot how to weave? If she forgot the old stories? If she forgot who Astrid was? The thought was like a cold hand reaching into Astrid's chest and squeezing her heart. She tried not to think about it, but the fear was always there, lurking at the edges of her mind. On the day our story truly begins, it was late summer. The days were growing shorter, though the change was so gradual you hardly noticed it unless you paid attention. The sun still rose early and set late, but not quite as early or as late as it had at midsummer. The warmth lingered, but there was a new quality to the air, a crispness that hadn't been there in July, a hint of the autumn to come. The mountainsides blazed with wildflowers in their last great display before frost would claim them. Purple heather covered the slopes like a royal robe. Yellow buttercups dotted the meadows. White wood anemones opened their star-shaped faces to the sun. Pink fireweed grew tall in any disturbed soil, its spikes of flowers glowing in the slanting light. The air smelled of pine resin and salt water, and the particular sweetness that comes just before autumn arrives, a smell of ripening berries and drying grass and earth preparing for sleep. Astrid came home from the docks around midday, her basket empty because she'd given away the fish Mrs. Olsen had gifted her to old Mrs. Berg, who was too frail to walk to the docks herself anymore. She climbed the path to the blue house, her feet knowing every stone and root along the way, and pushed open the gate that needed oiling and always creaked. Inside she found Mormor standing at the window in the front room, her hands resting on the loom but not moving, her eyes fixed on something far away. The loom sat silent, no clack 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 today. Sunlight streamed through the window, catching dust motes and making them dance like tiny stars, illuminating the half-finished tapestry on the loom. It was meant to be a scene of Strandvik in winter, with snow on the rooftops and ice on the fjord. But Mormor had only finished about half of it. Her grandmother's face wore an expression Astrid had never quite seen before, a mixture of sadness and longing and something else. Something that looked almost like hope, or perhaps like recognition, as if she were seeing something invisible to Astrid, something only she could perceive. "What are you looking at, Mormor?" Astrid asked, setting down her schoolbooks on the kitchen table with a soft thump. The books were for a summer project, an essay about local history that Astrid was supposed to write before school started again in a few weeks. Her grandmother turned slowly as if waking from a dream. Her movements had a strange quality, as if you were moving through water or through time itself. And when her eyes met Astrid's, the girl saw something there that made her heart clench, sadness mixed with longing, and beneath it all, a fear that Mormor was trying hard to hide but couldn't quite manage. "I'm remembering, little one," Mormor said softly, her voice barely above a whisper as fragile as the wing of a moth. Remembering the road beyond the last fjord. Astrid had never heard of such a road, and that was strange in itself because she knew every path and trail around Strandvik as well as she knew her own hands, had explored them all countless times over the years. There was the trail to the waterfall, a 40-minute walk up the mountainside that ended at a pool of crystal clear water fed by a cascade that tumbled down from a spring high above. In summer, if you were brave enough to face the shocking cold, you could swim there. Astrid had done it many times, diving into water so cold it made your breath catch, feeling the current from the waterfall massage your shoulders, floating on your back and looking up at the circle of sky framed by pine trees. There was the cliff walk to the lighthouse, a narrow path that hugged the edge of the rock high above the sea. You had to watch your footing because the drop was sheer and long, but if you were careful and didn't look down too much, you were rewarded with views that stretched forever. The fjord winding away inland like a blue ribbon, the open sea beyond glittering in the sun, the mountains marching away to the north and south in endless succession. There was the mountain road that switchbacked up to the summer pastures, where local farmers sent their cows to graze among the wildflowers. You could hear the cows before you saw them, the musical tinkling of the bells they wore around their necks, a sound that carried far in the clear mountain air. The pastures were beautiful, green meadows dotted with wildflowers, small wooden huts where the milkmaid stayed in summer, the grass cropped short by the patient chewing of dozens of cows. Yet there was the forest path that wound among ancient pines, where the air was always cool and quiet, where mushrooms grew in the shade, and you might glimpse a deer or a fox if you were lucky and quiet. There was the beach path that followed the rocky shore, where you could find tide pools full of small crabs and bright anemones, where driftwood accumulated in silvery piles after storms. But a road beyond the last fjord? That was something new, something she had never heard mentioned in all the stories told at the docks or around the fire. It was like discovering there was a room in your house you'd never noticed before, a door you'd walked past 1,000 times without seeing, or like being told that the sky was actually a different colour than you'd always thought. "Tell me about it," Astrid said, abandoning her schoolbooks completely and settling into the chair beside her grandmother. The chair was old and comfortable, its cushion worn smooth from years of use, shaped by the bodies of everyone who had ever sat in it. Through the window she could see the fjord stretching away toward the mountains, its surface rippled by a gentle breeze that ruffled the water into a pattern of small waves. A fishing boat was making its way home, its white sail bright against the dark water, leaning slightly as it caught the wind. Mormor was quiet for a long moment. Her fingers trailed along the windowsill, tracing patterns only she could see, spirals and lines that might have meant something, or might have been just the unconscious movements of an idle hand. Outside, a gull landed on the fence post with a flutter of white wings and began to preen its feathers, running its beak through them with focused attention. The clock on the mantel ticked steadily, marking the passage of seconds. A log shifted in the fireplace with a soft sigh. Finally, Mormor took a deep breath and began to speak. Her voice was soft as falling snow, distant as an echo from across a valley. When I was young, not much older than you are now, perhaps 12 or 13, I learned about a secret road. My own grandmother told me of it, just as I'm telling you now, just as her grandmother had told her. It's knowledge that's been passed down through the women of our family for generations, perhaps for centuries. We don't know how far back it goes, perhaps forever." She paused, gathering her thoughts, and Astrid waited patiently. She had learned long ago that the best way to hear a story was to be still and silent, to create a space for the words to flow into. "It's a road that appears only at twilight," Mormor continued, "in that magical hour when the day and night stand perfectly balanced, when the world hesitates between light and dark, when things that are usually hidden can sometimes be seen. The road appears at the head of the fjord, where the water ends and the mountains begin, winding up from the shore and disappearing into the mist that clings to the high places. One moment it's not there, and the next moment it is, as if it had always been there and you simply hadn't noticed before." She paused again, her eyes taking on that faraway look, as if she could see the road even now stretching away into memory and mist. "Those who walk this road," Mormor said, "find themselves in a place called the Valley of Echoes. It's a place between places, existing somehow alongside our world but separate from it, like a room built into the walls of a house, hidden but always there. In the Valley of Echoes, every sound ever spoken in these mountains is preserved. Every word, every song, every laugh and cry and whisper. They're all there, held safe like treasures in a vault, like books in a library, like jewels in a crown. The valley remembers what we forget. It keeps what we lose. And for those who know how to look, for those who need it badly enough, it's possible to find specific memories, specific moments in time, and bring them back." Astrid's eyes widened. This sounded like something from a fairy tale, from the old stories about magic and enchantment that Mormor told on long winter nights, and stories about trolls who turned to stone in sunlight, about Huldra, forest spirits who appeared as beautiful women from the front, but had tails like cows and backs like hollow tree trunks. Stories about the Fossagrim who lived in waterfalls and could teach you to play the fiddle if you brought him the right offering. Stories about Nukken who lurked in deep water and could drag you under if you weren't careful. But Mormor wasn't speaking in her storytelling voice, the special cadence she used for tales and legends. She was speaking in her ordinary voice, the one she used for talking about what happened yesterday, or what needed to be done tomorrow. She was speaking of this road and this valley as if they were real, as if she had been there herself, as real as the house they sat in or the fjord outside the window. "You've been there," Astrid said. It wasn't a question. "Once," Mormor confirmed. "When I was 12, I walked the road with my grandmother's blessing, though my parents knew nothing of it. They wouldn't have understood. They would have thought it was nonsense or dangerous or both. But my grandmother knew it was real, because her grandmother had told her about it and had made her promise to pass the knowledge on when the time came. And so, when I was old enough, she told me, and she gave me the compass, and she sent me on my way." "Compass?" Astrid asked. Mormor's hand moved to her throat, to the silver pendant that hung there on its fine chain. Astrid had seen that pendant many times. Mormor wore it every day, as much a part of her as her silver braid or her wise eyes, but she'd never really looked at it closely. It had always just been there, a piece of jewellery that Mormor never took off, even when she bathed or slept. Now, as Mormor held it up to the light, Astrid saw it clearly for the first time. It was a silver disc about the size of a large coin, maybe a little bigger. The surface was covered in strange markings, spirals and lines and symbols that Astrid didn't recognise. They weren't letters from any alphabet she knew, weren't runes like the ones carved on old stones or scratched into ancient artefacts in the museum in Bergen. These were something else, something older or stranger or both. As the pendant turned slowly in Morma's fingers, catching the light from different angles, the markings seemed to shift and move, rearranging themselves into new patterns. It must have been a trick of the light, Astrid thought. Yet the way the shadows changed as the pendant moved, but it looked for all the world as if the symbols were actually changing, actually rearranging themselves, as if the pendant were alive in some way. "This is a compass," Mormor said, "but not the kind you use in school geography lessons. It doesn't point to north or south or any of the cardinal directions. Instead, it points to the road, but only when worn by someone who truly needs to find it. It doesn't work for everyone, you see. It only works for those who have a reason to walk the road, who have a memory they need to recover or preserve. For everyone else, it's just a piece of silver with odd markings." She unfastened the chain from around her neck and held the pendant out, letting it dangle and sway slightly. The symbols caught the light, seeming to glow with their own inner radiance. "My grandmother gave it to me," Morma said. "Her grandmother gave it to her, and her grandmother before that, going back and back through the generations. We don't know where it came from originally. Perhaps it was always here, as old as the mountains themselves. Perhaps someone made it long ago, someone who understood magic in ways we've forgotten. It doesn't matter now. What matters is that it works, and that it's been passed down through our family for as long as anyone can remember. And now I'm giving it to you." She placed the pendant carefully in Astrid's outstretched palm. The silver was warm from Morma's skin, warm with her body heat, and heavier than Astrid had expected. It had a satisfying weight to it, substantial, real. This was not some fragile trinket, but something solid and enduring. Astrid closed her fingers around it, feeling the warmth, feeling the weight, feeling something else too, a kind of tingling, like very faint electricity, like the feeling you get sometimes when you touch metal on a dry day, but much gentler, much more subtle. It was almost as if the pendant were alive, as if it had its own quiet heartbeat that pulsed against her palm. "But why would I need to find it?" Astrid asked, though she thought she might already know the answer. There was only one reason Mormor would be giving her this pendant now, only one reason for this conversation. Mormor reached out and took Astrid's free hand in both of hers. Her skin was papery and soft, marked with age spots and the wear of hard work, decades of weaving, of gardening, of cleaning and cooking and carrying and all the 1,000 tasks that filled a life. But her grip was still strong, and her hands were warm. "Because, my dear one, I'm growing old. We both know that, though we haven't spoken of it directly until now. My memories are beginning to fade like morning mist when the sun comes up. Words slip away from me. Stories I've known my whole life, stories I've told 100 times, are becoming harder to remember. I lose track of what I was saying. I forget where I put things. And sometimes," her voice dropped to almost a whisper, "sometimes I look at familiar things and they seem strange to me, as if I'm seeing them for the first time, as if I've never seen them before in my life." Astrid's eyes burned with tears that she was trying very hard not to let fall. "There's something I left in the Valley of Echoes long ago," Mormor continued. "A memory I stored there for safekeeping, thinking I would return for it someday. I was young and foolish, and I thought I had all the time in the world. I thought memory was something that would always be there, that I could take for granted. But now I'm old, and my time is running short, and I need that memory back before it's lost forever. Lost to me, and lost to the valley as well. Because memories left unclaimed for too long begin to fade, even there in that place of preservation. Nothing lasts forever, Astrid. not even in the Valley of Echoes. Astrid felt her heart squeeze tight in her chest, as if a hand had reached in and grasped it. She had noticed the small changes in Mormor, the forgotten glasses, the lost words, the stories that trailed off mid-telling. She had noticed, and she had told herself they were nothing, just ordinary things that happened as people got older. But now, sitting here in the afternoon light with the silver pendant warm in her hand, she could no longer pretend. Her grandmother was asking for help, and that meant the problem was real and serious, more serious than Astrid had wanted to admit. "I'll find it," Astrid promised, her voice stronger than she felt, stronger than the fear that was trying to choke her words. "Whatever it is, wherever it is, I'll bring it back to you. I promise. What am I looking for?" Morma smiled, though tears glistened in her eyes, making them shine like the fjord in morning light. "A song," she said. "The first song my mother ever sang to me. She would sing it every night when she put me to bed, and in the mornings when I woke, and any time I was sad or frightened or hurt. It was our song, hers and mine, a lullaby that her mother had sung to her, and her mother's mother before that, going back through the generations just like this compass. It was about mountains and starlight, about the sea and the sky, about love that endured beyond all endings." She paused, swallowing hard, her fingers tightening on Astrid's hand. "When she died, I was only 16. I was so afraid of forgetting it, so terrified that the memory would fade with time, that the melody would slip away from me note by note until it was gone completely. The thought was unbearable. That song was all I had left of her voice, you see. So I took this compass and I walked the road beyond the last fjord, and I found the Valley of Echoes, and I gave the song to the valley for safekeeping. I thought I would go back for it someday when I was ready, when enough time had passed that I could bear to remember her without the grief being so sharp. But life happened, as it does. I grew up, I married, I had your mother, and the years passed so quickly, like water flowing through your fingers. And now I find that I can't quite remember how the song goes anymore. The melody is there, faint and far away, like something heard through thick walls or across a great distance. But I can't grasp it. I can't hear it clearly. And I need it back, Astrid. I need to hear my mother's voice again before I lose all my memories completely, before I forget not just the song, but everything else too. I need to remember who I am before it's too late." Astrid squeezed her grandmother's hands, blinking hard against tears. "I'll find it," she said again, and this time it was a vow, a sacred promise. The kind you make in your heart and know you'll keep no matter what it costs. I'll bring it back to you, I swear it. The next day was Saturday, which meant no school, and Astrid told her grandmother she was going for a long walk. She had done this many times before. Strandvik was a small village, where everyone knew everyone, where children could wander the trails safely, where the mountains were familiar friends rather than dangers to be feared. Mormor didn't question it, just smiled and packed Astrid a lunch. The lunch was simple but hearty. Thick slices of the dark bread with butter and cheese, a hard-boiled egg carefully wrapped in cloth, an apple from their small garden, one of the last of the season, its skin red and gold, and a flask of sweet tea made with honey and herbs. Mormor tucked it all into Astrid's canvas rucksack, along with an extra sweater, because mountain weather could change quickly, and a small first aid kit, so because she was practical above all things. Astrid wore her warmest sweater, the one Mormor had knitted the winter before, dark blue wool patterned with white reindeer and stars that marched across her chest and down her sleeves. It was thick and soft, and it smelled faintly of the lavender sachets Morma kept in the closet. She pulled on her sturdy walking boots, the ones with good grip on the soles, leather that was broken in and comfortable, laces that didn't come untied, and she tucked the silver pendant beneath her shirt, where it rested cool against her heart, hidden from casual eyes, but always present, always there. She set out as the afternoon sun began its slow descent toward the mountains. In summer this far north, sunset took hours. The sun would slide gradually down toward the horizon, painting the sky in ever-changing colours, and finally dipping below the mountains only to rise again after a brief twilight. But now, in late summer, true night was returning. The sun still set late, but it set completely, and the stars came out in their thousands, so many you couldn't count them all if you tried for a year. The shadows were lengthening as Astrid walked, stretching out across the path like dark fingers. The air was cooling, taking on that particular crispness that comes in the evening. She could smell the sea, salt and kelp, and the pine trees on the mountainside and the wild herbs that grew along the path, thyme and mint and something else she couldn't quite name. The path from the village led along the fjord's edge, following the curve of the shore. Here the water was deep and dark, reflecting the sky like a mirror. Small waves lapped gently against smooth stones worn round by centuries of tides, making a sound like whispered conversation, like the fjord itself was talking to the shore in a language older than words. Astrid walked steadily, her boots crunching on the gravel path, her breath coming easy and regular. She passed the red boathouse where nets hung drying in the breeze, casting latticed shadows on the weathered boards. The nets smelled of fish and salt, and they swayed gently, moved by the wind that was starting to pick up as evening approached. She passed the white church with its tall steeple pointing like a finger toward heaven, its bell silent now but ready to ring out the hours as it had done for 100 years. The churchyard beside it held the graves of everyone who had died in Strandvik since the church was built. Neat rows of stones, some so old the inscriptions had worn away to nothing, others still fresh with recently carved names and dates. She passed the last houses where the village ended and wilderness began, where tended gardens gave way to wild grass and cultivated flowers to the hardy blooms that grew naturally in this harsh but beautiful land. The houses here were painted in fading colours, their residents mostly elderly people who remembered when Strandvik had been bigger, busier, when the fishing had been better and young people hadn't left for the cities. Beyond the houses the path became rougher, less maintained. Grass grew between the stones, tree roots crossed it in places worn smooth by the feet of walkers. The forest pressed closer here, pine and birch creating a canopy overhead that filtered the light into dappled patterns. The head of the fjord was still an hour's walk away, but Astrid didn't mind. She enjoyed walking, enjoyed the rhythm of it, the way her body found its pace and her mind could wander. She thought about Mormor, about the story she'd told, about this road that appeared only at twilight. Part of her wondered if it was real, truly real, not just a story, but Mormor had seemed so certain, and Mormor was not given to fancies. The head of the fjord was a place of great beauty. Astrid had been there many times, but it never failed to move her. Mountains rose on either side, their peaks still touched with snow even though it was late summer. The rock faces were steep and dramatic, marked with the scars where ice and time had carved them into their present shapes. A waterfall cascaded down the northern cliff, its spray creating rainbows in the slanting light, its sound a constant rumble that you felt in your chest as much as heard with your ears. At the very end of the fjord, where fresh water from the mountains met the salt water from the sea, where the river that fed the fjord tumbled down from the high places, there was a small pebbled beach. Astrid had visited it many times, had skipped stones on the water, had sat on the smooth rocks and eaten her lunch, had watched eagles soaring overhead and seals bobbing in the deeper water. But today, as twilight began to gather in the valleys, painting the world in shades of blue and purple and soft gold, something was different. The air felt charged, expectant, as if the world itself was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. The quality of the light was strange, not quite day, not quite night, but something in between, something that made ordinary things look extraordinary, that made the familiar seem new. Astrid pulled out the silver pendant from beneath her shirt and held it in her palm, the chain pooling in her hand. The metal was warm from her body heat, warm from being pressed against her skin as she walked. She watched it, waiting, wondering if anything would happen. For a moment nothing did. The pendant just sat there in her palm, an ordinary piece of silver jewellery with strange markings. Then, as the light continued to change, as twilight deepened into that perfect balance point between day and night, the symbols on the pendant's surface began to glow. It was a soft blue light at first, barely visible, like the glow of foxfire in a dark forest, or the shimmer of phosphorescence in disturbed water. But it grew stronger, brighter, until the symbols stood out clearly, shining with their own radiance. The pendant grew warm in her hand, not uncomfortably so, but noticeably, unmistakably. It was no longer just reflecting light, but creating it, generating it from within. And then Astrid saw it, between the mountains where before there had been only steep rock faces and tangled forest, where no path could possibly exist. A road appeared. It was made of pale stones that seemed to glow in the dimming light, each one smooth and round, fitted perfectly to its neighbours. The road curved upward from the shore, winding between the rocks, it disappearing into the mist that clung to the mountainside like a living thing. The road hadn't been there a moment ago. Astrid was absolutely certain of that. She knew this place, had explored every metre of it over the years. There was no road here, no path, nothing but wilderness. And yet now there it was, as solid and real as the ground beneath her feet, as real as the mountains themselves. Astrid took a deep breath. Her heart was beating faster now, not from fear exactly, but from excitement and anticipation and perhaps a little nervousness. This was it. This was the road Mormor had spoken of, the road beyond the last fjord, and she was going to walk it. She put the pendant back under her shirt, adjusted her rucksack on her shoulders and stepped onto the road. Immediately everything changed. The sounds of the fjord, the water lapping against stones, the wind in the trees, the distant cry of gulls, faded to silence. Not a dead silence, but a soft, gentle quiet, like being inside a room with thick walls where outside sounds can't reach. The light became softer, gentler, as if filtered through pearl or mist or something that wasn't quite solid. The air smelled different too, still of pine and wild herbs, but with something added, a sweetness like honey and old paper, like the inside of an ancient library, the scent of preserved memories. The road climbed steadily upward, its stones smooth beneath Astrid's boots. On either side the mist swirled and eddied in patterns that seemed almost purposeful, almost intelligent. Within the mist Astrid could see shapes moving, shadows of trees that weren't quite trees, glimpses of stone walls and archways that appeared and disappeared like scenes from half-remembered dreams, fragments of things that might have existed long ago, or perhaps had never existed at all except in stories and imagination. She walked steadily, not hurrying, finding her rhythm again. The road rose and curved, switchbacking up the mountain in a way that should have been exhausting but somehow wasn't. Time felt different here, stretched and dreamlike, elastic, unreliable. She might have been walking for minutes or hours. She couldn't tell and found she didn't care. As she climbed higher, Astrid began to hear sounds emerging from the silence. At first they were faint, like whispers carried on a wind that didn't exist, like voices heard through water or walls. Then they grew clearer, yet more distinct. Voices speaking in her own language but in accents and rhythm she didn't recognize. Old voices and young voices, voices filled with laughter and sorrow and love and anger, and all the emotions that humans had ever felt. These were the echoes Morma had spoken of, sounds preserved by the valley, held safe from the passage of time, kept perfect and pure like insects trapped in amber or seeds sealed in jars. Nothing was lost here. Everything was remembered. She heard a mother calling her children home for dinner, her voice carrying across distance and decades. "Eric! Solveig! Come in now, the fish is ready." She heard men singing a work song as they hauled nets full of fish, their voices deep and harmonious, keeping time with the rhythm of their pulling. She heard a wedding celebration, the guests cheering and clapping as the bride and groom danced, someone playing a fiddle with more enthusiasm than skill. All these moments, captured and kept, all these lives preserved. It was like walking through history, through memory itself, through the accumulated experience of everyone who had ever lived in these mountains. As she climbed higher still, Astrid noticed something moving on the road ahead. At first she thought it was just another swirl of mist, another shadow cast by nothing. But then it resolved into a definite shape, a small animal with grey fur that seemed to shimmer and shift, with bright, intelligent eyes that caught the strange light and threw it back. A fox, Astrid realised, but unlike any fox she'd seen before, and she'd seen plenty around Strandvik, had watched them hunting in the meadows, or had seen their tracks in winter snow. This one moved with an odd grace, almost floating rather than walking, and its eyes were different, ancient, knowing, as if it had seen things no ordinary animal could have seen, as if it understood more than an animal should be able to understand. The fox sat down in the middle of the road and looked at Astrid expectantly, its head tilted slightly to one side, its tail curled neatly around its paws. "Hello," Astrid said, feeling only slightly foolish for talking to an animal. To her amazement, though not quite to her surprise, because in a place like this, in a place where roads appeared from nothing and echoes lived forever, why wouldn't a fox be able to talk? The animal spoke. Its voice was clear and bright, like the sound of small bells or wind chimes made of silver. "Hello, traveller," said the fox. "I am Revna, keeper of this road. You wear the compass of seeking. What memory do you search for? I hope this journey beyond the last fjord brought you wonder and peace. If this story helped you drift toward dreams, please subscribe for more magical bedtime adventures. Until tomorrow night, sleep well and dream of roads that wind through starlight.